The waves had been calm that morning, the sea as still as polished glass. From the cliffside chapel, Father Aldrich watched the three fishermen launch their boat, their laughter echoing faintly against the rocky shore. It was just after dawn, and the salt-slicked wind carried the scent of kelp and wood smoke. By midday, their nets should have returned heavy with cod, but the boat never came back. By sunset, the village gathered on the pebbled beach, eyes squinting against the fading light. Only silence greeted them until a child cried out. Footprints. A hush fell over the crowd as they followed the boy's outstretched hand. Leading from the sea to the rocky shore was a trail of wet footprints, bare, large, and spaced unnaturally far apart. No boat, no bodies, just prints that shimmered before drying in the wind. Father Aldrich knelt beside the first mark. The shape was odd, elongated, almost webbed. Not human. This is a warning, murmured old Miller, the fishmonger's widow. They've returned. Who? Aldrich asked, his voice calm but eyes sharp. The ones from beneath, she whispered. The drowned walkers. That night, the chapel bell rang once, an old custom when the sea claimed its own. Aldrich stayed behind long after the others had gone. Candlelight flickered over a weathered tome on his desk, bound in salt-stained leather. He turned to the chapter he never thought he'd read again. Of the deep ones that walk upon land when the tide brings them forth. He stared at the dark sea beyond his window. Something had awakened, and it was coming ashore. The next morning, the village woke to a thick mist blanketing the coast, so dense it seemed to muffle sound itself. Father Aldrich moved through it like a ghost, his cassock damp with sea spray. The chapel bell remained silent, its rope swaying gently, though no wind blew. At the docks, Aldrich found old Miller hunched over a basket of untouched fish, eyes distant. They say you read from the Black Book, she said without turning. I did, Aldrich admitted, and I will again. She looked at him then, her face lined like old driftwood. You're not the first priest to pry open that curse. The last one vanished too. Just like the others. Aldrich nodded grimly and made his way back to the chapel. Inside, the air felt colder. He reopened the ancient tome, its pages now stiff with moisture. Strange symbols decorated the margins, some shaped like spirals, others like open mouths. Those who walk from the waves leave no boat behind, only footprints. Always barefoot, always toward the land. He flipped to a folded parchment tucked between the pages, a map. The coastline was marked with tiny inked X6, each with a name beside it. All names of fishermen who had vanished over the last century, many Aldrich recognized from the old gravestones in the chapel yard. One X stood out. Gull's Point, a jagged bluff north of the castle, where the tides churned violently. Just then, a knock echoed through the chapel. 3 sharp raps. Aldrich froze. No one used the chapel door this early. He opened it. No one stood there. Only the mist rolling thick and slow like breath. And then he saw them. Footprints, wet, glistening and freshly pressed, leading away from the threshold, not toward it. Something had been inside. Father Aldrich followed the wet footprints through the village, their size and spacing unsettling. They weaved between cottages and disappeared at the edge of the eastern cliff, where the sea churned restlessly below. He paused there, hands behind his back, staring into the gray horizon. He needed answers. That afternoon, Aldrich descended into the crypt beneath the chapel, a narrow staircase leading to the oldest part of the structure. Here, under vaulted stone arches and candle smoke, the air was thick with centuries of salt, dust, and prayer. At the far end, behind rusted iron bars, sat the sealed reliquary of Saint Brannock. Local legend held that Saint Brannock, the first priest of the coastal village, had once banished beings of the sea during the Age of Sail. His writings had been buried with him, locked away by the church as heresy. But Aldrich now believed those writings might be the key. He jimmied the old gate open, the metal groaning like a dying gull. Inside the reliquary, beneath the saint's preserved robes and bone fragments, he found a weathered scroll sealed in wax. Breaking it, he read aloud, "When the sea grows still and the mist creeps in, the walkers rise not to hunt, but to return. Not all who vanish are taken. Some become." The last word was smeared, but it chilled Aldrich to the marrow. Become. Outside, the church bell rang. No hands had pulled its rope. He bolted up the stairs, heart thudding. Villagers were already gathered outside the chapel, staring at the castle in the distance, its high tower cloaked in fog. Another boat was missing, and a new trail of footprints led from the water, straight toward the castle gates. The castle loomed above the cliffs like a sleeping beast, its crumbling towers jutting into the mist. Few dared go near it. Even fewer returned with stories they dared speak aloud. But the footprints led there, wet, heavy, and deliberate. Father Aldrich stood at the threshold of its great iron gate, now hanging ajar. Moss choked the stone walls, and a cold dampness clung to everything. He crossed himself and stepped inside. The castle's main hall was vast and hollow, filled with the stink of mold and seawater. As he advanced, his footsteps echoed too loudly until he realized they weren't echoes at all. Something else was moving deeper within. He passed faded tapestries and broken suits of armor, their surfaces slick with condensation. Then he reached the old chapel, a room within the castle where royalty once knelt in prayer. Its altar was broken in two, as though something had smashed it from within. Beneath the rubble, a strange symbol had been scratched into the floor, a spiral of overlapping footprints all pointing inward. The center was worn smooth, as if many feet had stood there, bare, heavy feet. Suddenly, he heard it. A voice, no, many voices, whispering in unison, rising like wind through a cave. He couldn't make out words, only shapes of sound that tugged at memory, half dreamed and half feared. Then something moved in the shadows. A figure, tall and soaked, emerged from a dark corridor. Its skin was pale and glistening, and its eyes glowed faintly like kelp under moonlight. Aldrich stepped back, heart hammering. "Who are you?" The figure opened its mouth, and from it came a voice not its own, one he recognized, the voice of Thomas, one of the lost fishermen. "Help me, before I forget." And then it vanished into the mist-filled corridor, leaving behind only the sound of dripping water and a trail of fresh footprints, still wet. Back in the chapel, Father Aldrich lit every candle he could find. Shadows danced wildly on the stone walls, flickering like waves under stormlight. He had returned from the castle just before dawn, drenched in sweat and salt, the fisherman's voice still echoing in his ears. "Help me, before I forget." Forget what? Himself? His life? His soul? Aldrich opened the ancient tome once more. Near the back was a passage he hadn't noticed before, inscribed in faded ink beneath a water-stained page. It spoke of the Tidebound, a name given to those lured by the sea's call and returned. Changed. The Tidebound wear no chains but carry the mark of the deep. As they forget the land forgets them in turn. Their memories dissolve, their bodies twist. Only in sacred light may they speak true. Aldrich froze. Sacred light. He rushed to the reliquary and gathered what remained of St. Brannock's belongings. A silver cross etched with coral-like patterns, and a small vial of blessed oil, still sealed, still potent. He knew what he must do. By sunset, he stood once more at the castle's gates, cross in one hand, oil in the other. The mist thickened as he stepped through, but he followed the prince again, down crumbling stairs into the heart of the keep. There, in a vast flooded chamber beneath the castle, he found them. Fishermen, half submerged, standing still as statues. Their eyes were open but empty. Their skin had taken on a faint shimmer, like scales under moonlight. One of them turned slowly. Thomas. Aldrich raised the silver cross. "In the name of Saint Brannock, I call you back." Thomas blinked once. A flicker of something passed across his face. Pain? Hope? Then the chamber trembled. The water stirred. And from beneath the surface, something ancient began to rise. The water in the chamber boiled without heat, swirling into a vortex at its center. Father Aldrich stepped back, shielding his face from the spray. The silver cross trembled in his grasp. Beneath the rippling surface, vast shapes moved, slow and sinuous, like coiled ropes or limbs far too long to belong to any man. The fishermen remained still, as if bound by an invisible tide. Only Thomas moved slightly, his gaze locked onto Aldrich's. "It comes," he whispered. "The memory taker." Aldrich unscrewed the vial of sacred oil and poured it over the cross. The silver flared with white light, cutting through the gloom. The walls of the chamber groaned in protest. Columns shuddered. From the vortex, a shape began to rise. It was not a creature, but a form, tall, vaguely human, but stretched and wrong. Its face had no eyes, only a mouth that gaped wide enough to swallow a man whole. And around its neck hung dozens of trinkets, rings, lockets, tools, keepsakes from the lost, from the taken. The fishermen swayed in unison as if pulled toward it. "No!" Aldrich shouted, stepping between them and the thing. He held the cross high, and the light struck the creature's skin. It shrieked, not in pain, but in rage, a sound that shook the stones. Then it spoke, not aloud, but inside his mind. "He gave us to the sea. He made us forget. You would undo what was promised?" Aldrich's knees buckled, but he forced himself upright. "These men are not yours. They are of the land, and they will return to it." The cross burned brighter. The creature hissed, the water surged, but in that final moment, Thomas lunged forward, not toward the creature, but toward the spiral etched into the stone floor. He stepped into its center and vanished in a flash of blinding light. The others followed, one by one, until the chamber was empty but for Aldrich and the fading echo of 1,000 voices whispering from the deep. Then the vortex collapsed, and silence returned. The sea was calm again. Days had passed since the castle's foundations had shaken, and the fishermen vanished in a burst of blinding light. The villagers waited for wreckage, for bodies, for closure, but none came. Only silence and low tide. Father Aldrich stood alone at Gull's Point, wind tugging at his robes. In his hand was the silver cross, now dim and cool. The blessed oil was gone, but so too was the presence that haunted the waves. Thomas had vanished along with the others, but not into death. No, Aldrich believed something else had happened, something older than death. He turned from the cliffs and walked the beach. The mist had lifted. The sky was pale and cloudless. Then he saw them. Footprints. But these were different. Smaller, dry, human. They trailed from the tree line to the shoreline and stopped. No returning prints. Just an arrival. As if someone had come from the woods and walked into the sea. Aldrich knelt, tracing one with his finger. Fresh. He followed the trail back, deeper into the woods, heart pounding. The footprints led him to a clearing near the edge of the village, a place he recognized, the old chapel ruins, burned out centuries ago. And in the center, where no one had walked in generations, stood a man, Thomas. His clothes were dry, his eyes clear. He smiled faintly but said nothing. Aldrich approached, mouth dry. "How did you return?" Thomas looked past him toward the distant sea. I didn't. And then he stepped backward into the chapel's shadow and was gone. No wind stirred, no sound followed, only the faint echo of waves against the cliffs. That night, Aldrich wrote a single line in the black book before sealing it once more. The sea does not keep what it takes. It remembers.